The bottle washed ashore on a quiet stretch of Wharton Beach in Western Australia on a normal morning in 2025. A family walking along the sand noticed something half buried near the high tide line, a small glass cylinder with its cork still intact. It looked like nothing more than an old discarded relic, until they saw the faint roll of paper inside. When the bottle was opened, the paper was brittle, yellowed and trembling at the edges, but the pencil writing was still legible. A message dated August 15, 1916. A note written in the middle of the First World War. A letter that had spent more than a century drifting through the world's oceans before coming to rest on an Australian beach. When historians at the Australian War Memorial examined it, they confirmed the impossible. It was real, authentic. A message written aboard HMAT A70 Ballarat by two soldiers of the Australian Imperial Force, Malcolm Alexander Neville and William Kirk Harley, as they sailed away from Australia toward the Western Front in France. Their words, preserved by salt, air and chance, offered a quiet window into a moment where hope, fear and youth collided on the edge of war. Neville's handwriting was casual but warm. He wrote to his mother, Robertina, back in Wilkewott, South Australia. "Having a real good time," he began, joking about a bad meal they buried at sea, describing the ship's rough movement, yet insisting he was as happy as Larry. Harley added his own message in the same bottle, a line that echoed across time. "May the finder be as well as we are at present." These were not dramatic battlefield testimonies. They were the voices of two ordinary men, suspended between home and the greatest conflict their generation would ever know. And they cast their words into the sea without knowing if anyone would ever find them. In 2025, more than 100 years later, someone finally did, and through that single bottle, a forgotten fragment of 1916 rose back into the world, pulling with it the weight of the past, the aftermath of Gallipoli, the brutal transition to the Western Front, and the emotional strain on Australian soldiers preparing for a war far from home. Their letter became a bridge across time, linking the hopes of two men in 1916 to a world that no longer remembered their faces but now held their words in its hands. To understand the weight carried inside that small bottle, you have to step back into 1916, into the world Neville and Harley were living in as they wrote their message. Australia was still reeling from the Gallipoli campaign. The landings of April 1915 had turned into months of grinding stalemate, disease and heavy casualties, ending finally in evacuation. The men who returned carried scars both visible and invisible, and the men who enlisted afterward carried the memory of that defeat like a shadow. By mid-1916, the Australian Imperial Force was being rebuilt and prepared for a very different kind of war on the Western Front. The trenches of France were nothing like the cliffs of Gallipoli. This new front was a landscape of mud, artillery, barbed wire, and constant industrial violence. Australian soldiers knew the stories coming back from the Somme, of entire units erased in minutes, of weeks without proper rest, of a kind of warfare more mechanized and unforgiving than anything Australia had ever imagined participating in. Neville and Harley were part of the wave of reinforcements leaving their homes, families and familiar lives behind. Their ship, the Ballarat, carried men who had grown up on farms, in small towns, or in the expanding industrial centres of the young Commonwealth. These were sons, brothers, workers, friends, most of them in their early 20s, many leaving Australia for the first time. As the ship rolled through the Southern Ocean swells, there was a peculiar mixture of excitement and fear. They were determined to do their duty, but they also felt the uncertainty of a war that had already consumed so many. In the days before radio contact became reliable, and long before soldiers could send instant messages home, communication was painfully slow. Many carried the ache of separation quietly. A simple letter could take months. A message in a bottle was a long shot, almost a superstition, but it was also a gesture of hope that something of themselves might reach home, even if they never did. So on August 15, 1916, somewhere between Australia and the war that awaited them, Neville and Harley sat down and wrote words that were honest, brief, and deeply human. They didn't write about fear, they didn't write about dread. They wrote about the small things, the kind of things men write when they don't want their families to worry. The ocean was rough, the food was questionable, but they were well. They were joking, they were thinking of home. With their messages finished, they rolled the paper, placed it into the small bottle, sealed it, and let it fall into the sea. It was something between a farewell and a promise. And then they turned back to the deck of their ship, unaware that the bottle would outlive them, outlive the war, and wait more than a century to be found. The contents of the letter seem simple at first glance, but each line carries the quiet emotional truth of men suspended between the lives they left behind and the war waiting ahead. Neville's note begins with a lightness that feels almost like a smile across time. He writes to his mother as if he were only a few towns away, not halfway around the world. He reassures her that he is well, that the ship is treating them fine, and that he is enjoying the journey. He even adds a bit of humor, describing a particularly bad meal that the men jokingly buried at sea. It is the sort of detail a son includes when he wants to keep a worried mother calm. Beneath the humor sits the steady pulse of longing. He wants her to know he is strong, he is steady, he is safe. Then he signs his name, Malcolm Alexander Neville. A young man who believed he would write again soon, unaware that this moment, this brief message tossed into the sea, would someday become the last surviving echo of his handwriting. Harley's edition is shorter, but it carries its own quiet weight. His line is hopeful, almost philosophical. May the finder be as well as we are at present. It is a wish cast outward into the future, a hope that whoever eventually held this message would be safe, healthy, and far from war. The kindness of it stands out. Even on the edge of a global conflict, he wrote with generosity, as if he sensed that the ocean might carry his words farther than he could ever imagine. The tone of the letter is gentle, almost ordinary, no fear, no prediction of what was coming. No hint that the Western Front would soon swallow their generation. But in that ordinariness lies the power of the letter. Neville and Harley were not writing history. They were simply writing home, and because of that, their words feel alive, unguarded, true. Historians who examined the letter in 2025 were struck by its preservation. The pencil marks remained sharp where the strokes were hard, faded where the writing softened. The folds showed where the paper had been carefully creased by hand. The bottle itself had kept the message safe from salt water, sunlight, and the slow decay of time. It was as though the ocean had chosen to protect this single fragment of two young men's lives, allowing it to surface long after the war that shaped it had ended. The letter does not speak of battles because in August 1916, Neville and Harley had not yet reached France, but knowing what came next adds an ache to every word. Only months later, Australian troops would be thrown into the turmoil of the Western Front. They would face artillery bombardments that shook the earth, trenches filled with mud and rainwater, machine gun fire that cut down entire waves of advancing soldiers. They would learn the reality of European warfare, a kind of conflict that destroyed landscapes and reshaped nations. But on the day they wrote that message, the war was still a distant horizon. The young men who dropped that bottle into the sea were filled with the optimism of soldiers who believed they would write again, return again, live again. Their letter captures the last quiet breath before the storm. When the bottle was opened in 2025, more than a century after it was set afloat, the world that Neville and Harley knew had vanished entirely, yet the moment the letter was read, the past stepped forward with remarkable clarity. The handwriting brought back the voice of a young Australian soldier who had sailed toward a future he could not see. The signatures revived the identities of two men whose names had faded into the lists of the First World War. And the date, August 15, 1916, anchored the letter to a moment when the war was entering one of its most devastating phases. By the time Neville and Harley reached the Western Front, the Australian divisions were already deeply entrenched in the fighting. The battles of Fromelles and Pozières had inflicted staggering casualties. Thousands of young Australians had been killed or wounded in a few terrible weeks. The men who survived spoke of artillery barrages so constant they felt like the sky itself was being torn apart. They described the smell of mud mixed with blood, the weight of gear soaked by endless rain, and the sudden terror of gas alarms in the night. This was the environment the two men were moving toward when they wrote their letter. The kind of war where messages home were treasured because tomorrow was never guaranteed. Records show that both men continued on with their units, part of a reinforcement stream that fed the front line with soldiers who had barely experienced a battlefield before being thrust into its harsh reality. The discovery of their message forces us to imagine what might have happened in the months that followed. Whether they survived the worst of the Western Front, whether they returned home, whether they ever wrote another letter that reached the people they cared about. For many soldiers of the Australian Imperial Force, the Western Front became the place where youth ended, where hope was tested, where the cost of global conflict etched itself into the identity of an entire nation. Modern historians examining the 1916 bottle were careful to place the letter in the context of the time. Messages like this were sometimes dropped into the ocean out of boredom or curiosity, but often they reflected a deeper need to feel connected to home. Long voyages could stretch for weeks, and the loneliness of leaving everything familiar behind often surged during those quiet days at sea. A bottle overboard became a symbolic gesture, a way of saying that part of them was still reaching back toward Australia, even as the rest of them sailed toward France. The coastline of Wharton Beach is thousands of kilometers from the ship routes used in 1916. The ocean's currents had carried this single bottle across unimaginable distances through storms, tides, and changing climates. That it survived at all is extraordinary. That it reached Australian shores again more than a century later feels almost like the ocean itself returned it to the land the men once called home. The Australian War Memorial authenticated the letter with care, cross-referencing names, dates, military records, and the ship's documented movements. Everything aligned. The handwriting style, the references in the message, the route of the Ballarat, the timing of its departure, and the identities of Malcolm Alexander Neville and William Kirk Harley. The letter was not fiction. It was a genuine voice from 1916, preserved with almost impossible luck. And so this small message, light-hearted, hopeful, written by two young men standing on the brink of history, became one of the most powerful artifacts of the war. Because it was not a speech, not a battlefield report, not an official military document. It was something far simpler. A moment of humanity that had drifted across a century to remind the world that behind every uniform, every marching column, every casualty number, there were individuals with families, with hopes, with lives waiting on the other side of the world. The story of the Wharton Beach letter concludes not with a dramatic revelation, but with something far more powerful, the quiet endurance of memory. When archivists held the fragile paper in their hands, they were aware that they were touching one of the rarest forms of communication from the First World War. An unfiltered, unedited message written at a moment when the war's future was still unknown to the men who would fight it. In a conflict defined by massive offensives, political speeches, and sweeping military movements, this small personal note stood out because it captured what often disappears in the retelling: the simple humanity of the soldiers who carried the war on their shoulders. The letter was displayed briefly, carefully protected from light and humidity, and the story of its discovery spread across Australia. Newspapers covered the find not because the words spoke of strategy or heroism, but because they reminded people of the young men who left their homes thinking the war would be an adventure. They reminded people that soldiers did not live continuously inside the terror of battle. They had moments of humor, moments of tenderness, moments where they tried to reassure the families who waited anxiously for news. The message in a bottle, sealed and sent drifting into the vast ocean, captured that sense of uncertainty. Neville and Harley did not know where their words would go, or whether they would be read by anyone at all. But they wrote anyway. That act alone speaks to something deep within the human experience, the need to reach outward, to connect, to declare that you were here, that your life mattered, that your thoughts might find someone in a distant place or distant time. What no one could have predicted is how far those words would travel. For over a century, the bottle survived storms, currents, and time. Long after the war had ended, long after the men who wrote it had passed away, long after their families had faded into history, their voices were still preserved. They had not been erased by the world. They had simply been waiting. The discovery in 2025 brought them back into the light. Their words once again reached Australian shores just as they had hoped in 1916, when the ship carrying them sailed away. In the vastness of the First World War, with its millions of soldiers, its endless trenches, its immeasurable suffering, it can be easy to lose sight of individual lives. But this letter returned those lives to the forefront. It reminded people that every soldier had a story beyond their service number, beyond their regiment, beyond the pages of military history. In the end, the letter held no grand secret. Its power came from its ordinary truth. Two young Australian soldiers, caught between the comfort of home and the uncertainty of war, wrote messages filled with warmth, humour, and hope. They placed their words in glass and trusted them to the sea. And the sea delivered them back to the nation that had sent those men across the world. More than a century after the letter was written, it became a bridge connecting the present to the past, the living to the gone, and the peace of modern Australia to the turmoil of 1916. It showed that even in an age defined by global conflict, simple human connection could endure longer than any nation, any army, or any war. And so the bottle found on Wharton Beach became more than an artifact. It became a reminder that the voices of those who lived through the First World War still speak, still matter, and still deserve to be heard. If you want, I can now create a YouTube description, SEO tags, or a shorter summary version.